The world knows them as statues of stone, men of unblinking discipline who stand guard over history itself. Their precision is legendary, their composure superhuman. For 60 years, James McAllister has watched them, a ritual born of his own silent battles. He believes their silence is cold, their discipline a wall. He is wrong, because on a crisp autumn morning, when a memory from a Korean hillside ambush sends Mac's world crumbling, the most unexpected of human bridges is built, not with words, but with a single, deliberate, and devastatingly human tear traced down the cheek of a guardsman who never, ever moves. This is the true story of the day the monument became a man, and a forgotten soldier found he was not alone. The autumn air in London held a sharp, clean chill, the kind that made the breath visible and polished the sky to a pale, hard blue. At the heart of the city, the ceremony of the changing of the guard at Buckingham Palace unfolded with its timeless, hypnotic rhythm. Tourists elbowed for position. Smartphones held aloft like digital offerings to the spectacle of scarlet tunics, bearskin hats, and boots that struck the ground with a sound like cracking ice. Among the crowd, but always apart from it, stood James McAllister. At 84, he was a lean, upright figure in a worn but carefully brushed overcoat. His hands, speckled with age and scarred from old labor, were clasped tightly behind his back. He came here every Tuesday. It was his pilgrimage. Mac didn't come for the pageantry. He came for the guards. To him, they were not just soldiers. They were echoes of a code he understood, a living testament to a discipline that had shaped his own life, though in a very different theater. His war had been in Korea, a brutal, frozen conflict often called the Forgotten War. He had been a young lieutenant, barely 20, leading men through snow-choked valleys where the enemy was not just the opposing force, but the very elements. The memory of that time was a locked box within him, its contents too sharp and too painful to examine. But watching these guardsmen stand perfectly still, mastering their own bodies and minds against fatigue, distraction, and the relentless click of cameras gave him a strange, silent solace. It was a control he had spent a lifetime trying to emulate, a wall against the chaos of memory. His usual spot was by the Victoria Memorial, giving him a clear view of the sentry box. His eyes would settle on one guardsman, following the rigid posture, the fixed gaze that saw everything and acknowledged nothing. He'd note the minute signs of strain, a slight tightening of the jaw, an almost imperceptible shift of weight, and feel a camaraderie he could never voice. He imagined the young man inside the uniform, the thoughts running through his head, the discipline required to suppress every natural impulse. He thought they were islands of iron will, just as he had tried to be. He was about to learn how deeply he had misunderstood. The incident began not with a bang, but with a whisper from the past. A child in the crowd, frustrated and cold, let out a sharp, sudden wail. It was a sound of pure, uncomplicated distress. For most, it was a minor annoyance. For Mac, it was a trigger. The high-pitched cry sliced through the autumn air and through 6 decades of careful compartmentalization. It morphed in his mind into the scream of a young private, a boy from Liverpool named Tommy, caught in a surprise ambush on a hillside near the chosen reservoir. The memory didn't return as a thought. It invaded as a full sensory assault. The crisp London air vanished, replaced by the biting, metallic cold of a Korean winter. The scent of diesel and autumn leaves became the stench of cordite and frozen earth. The colorful crowd blurred into the stark, white and gray nightmare of that day. Mac's breath hitched. The carefully maintained wall in his mind crumbled. He saw it all again. The crack of sniper fire, the chaotic dash for cover, Tommy's scream cut horrifically short. He had dragged the boy behind a rock, his hands scrambling against the wet, red snow, trying to stem a wound that was beyond stemming. Tommy had looked at him, his eyes wide with a child's confusion, and had spoken not a word of fear, but a mumbled apology for letting the lads down. Then, the light had gone out of his eyes. Mac had held him until he was cold, the guilt settling into his bones, a permanent, frozen companion. Now, on the safe London pavement, the world tilted. The proud, upright veteran swayed. His knuckles turned white as he gripped the cold railing of the memorial. A low, involuntary groan escaped his lips, a sound of such profound and ancient grief that a few nearby tourists glanced over, their expressions shifting from curiosity to concern. He tried to focus on the guard, to use that image of discipline as an anchor, but his vision swam. He was failing. The control he had admired and sought to mirror was deserting him, and he was tumbling back into the frozen hell of a memory he could never outrun. The guardsman on duty was a man named Private Thomas Tomo Evans. He had seen the old veteran many times. The regulars, the watchers, were part of the landscape. But he had noted Mac, the straight back, the quiet observation, the military bearing that time, could not erase. He had always wondered about his story. As the ritual unfolded, Tomo's trained eyes, which saw everything within his arc of responsibility, caught the change. He saw the old man's body stiffen, saw the tremor in his clasped hands, saw the face lose its composed neutrality and contort with a private agony. He saw the sway. This was not a tourist feeling faint. This was a man being viscerally haunted. Every fiber of Tomo's training screamed to maintain his post, to be the unmoving statue. His duty was to the crown, to the symbol. But another duty, older and more fundamental, stirred within him. He was a soldier. He recognized the silent battle being lost just yards away. It was a look he had seen in the eyes of comrades returned from tours in Afghanistan, a 1,000-yard stare filled with ghosts. As Mac's knees began to buckle, a monumental internal conflict raged within Tomo. The regiment's doctrine was absolute, and yet the man before him was breaking. In that split second, the human being triumphed over the symbol. In a move that defied every protocol, Tomo's head turned just a few degrees. His eyes, meant to stare blankly ahead, locked directly onto Mac's. It was a clear, deliberate, and shocking breach of character. The connection was electric. Mac, spiraling into the past, felt the gaze. He dragged his eyes up and met those of the guardsman. He expected to see disapproval or robotic emptiness. Instead, he saw recognition. He saw a deep, knowing concern. In that shared look, spanning 60 years and two vastly different wars, Mac felt a thread of understanding thrown to him across the abyss. But it was what happened next that would be seared into the memory of everyone who saw it. As Tomo held the old veteran's crumbling gaze, a single tear welled in his own eye, defying the cold air and iron discipline. It traced a slow, glistening path down his cheek, cutting through the formal facade like a crack in marble. It was a silent, profound communication. It said, "I see your pain. You are not alone." The monument had wept, and in that impossible, heartfelt tear, Mac found a handhold back to the present. He took a shuddering breath, his own eyes flooding in response. The guard gave an almost imperceptible, slow nod, then, with Herculean effort, returned his gaze forward, his face once again becoming a mask. But the tear stain remained, a testament to the breach. The spell was broken, but a new, unspoken bond had been forged in its place. The crowd, initially puzzled, had begun to murmur. A ripple of confusion spread. Had they really seen that? The guard had moved. He had cried. Phones, which had been pointed at the ceremony, now lowered, their owners unsure if they had witnessed a profound moment or a breach of protocol, so severe it felt intimate. For Mac, the world snapped back into focus with a jarring clarity. The Korean winter receded, the sounds of the ambush fading into the distant hum of London traffic and the hushed, bewildered whispers around him. The cold stone of the memorial beneath his hand was real, solid, anchoring. He was here. He was now. He stared at the guardsman, Tomo, who was once again the picture of stoic endurance, save for the faint, damning track on his cheek. The shame Mac had felt a moment before. Shame at his public vulnerability, was washed away by a wave of overwhelming gratitude. That single tear had been a lifeline. It had acknowledged a pain so deep Mac had carried it like a secret sin for most of his life. He wasn't a mad old man having an episode. He was a soldier being seen by another soldier. He gave a slow, deliberate nod of his own, a silent thank you transmitted across the space between them. The guard's eyes, fixed forward, seemed to soften at the edges. The message was received, but the machinery of tradition was not so easily swayed. The officer of the guard, a crisp, authoritative figure, had noticed the disturbance in his periphery. He had seen the veteran's near collapse and, more critically, his guardsman's break in posture. As the changeover ceremony continued with its clockwork precision, the officer's mind raced. Protocol was clear. Private Evans would be relieved at the end of his watch and would face a certain and severe reprimand. His career, built on discipline and conformity, now hung in the balance over a moment of compassion. The officer felt a conflict of his own. He too was a soldier, but he was also a custodian of one of the world's most visible traditions. The human impulse warred with institutional duty. Mac, sensing the looming consequence for the young man who had helped him, felt a new kind of resolve harden within him. He would not let this boy suffer for an act of kindness. He waited, standing straighter now, as the new guard was posted and Tomo was marched off with his detail. Mac followed at a distance, his steps firm. He watched as the detail dispersed within the confines of the palace grounds. He knew he had to get a message through, to explain. Approaching a police officer near the gates, Mac, with the bearing of the officer he once was, said, "I need to speak with the officer of the guard, regarding one of his men. It's a matter of importance." His tone brooked no argument. After some hesitation and a few radio calls, he was escorted not into the palace, but to a subdued office in the guard's quarters. The room was spare, functional, smelling of polish and old stone. The officer of the guard, Captain Jameson, sat behind a desk, his expression unreadable. Tomo stood at attention before him, his bearskin hat under his arm, face pale but set. "Sir," Mac began, his voice rough but clear, "this is my doing." That young man, he pointed at Tomo, he saw an old soldier in trouble. He acted as a human being first. If anyone is to be reprimanded, it should be me for causing a disturbance. Captain Jameson listened, his eyes assessing the old veteran. "The standards of the Queen's Guard are absolute, Mr. McAllister," he said formally. "Private Evans broke character. He compromised the integrity of the post." "He saved mine," Mac replied, his voice gaining strength. "You see a breach of protocol. I saw a moment of grace. I was in Korea, Captain. 1952. I haven't spoken of it in 60 years. Something happened out there today. A memory. He saw me drowning in it." Mac's eyes locked with Tomo's, who was still rigidly at attention. "That tear of his, sir, it was the first time anyone has ever acknowledged that it was real. I was still in there. He didn't move a muscle to help me, but he did more for me in that one look than any doctor or counselor ever has." The room was silent. Captain Jameson studied the two soldiers, one young, his career on the line, the other old, his eyes holding the weight of a century's sorrow. The captain was a military man through and through. He understood duty, but he also understood the unspoken bonds of service. He saw in Mac the ghosts of wars that were history to him, but living memory to this man. He saw in Evans the instinct that makes a soldier more than just a uniform, the instinct to protect, even from a ghost. "Private Evans," the captain said, his voice quieter now, "dismissed. Wait outside." When Tomo had left, the captain leaned forward. "Tell me, Mr. McAllister, tell me what he saw." And so, in that small, plain room, Mac began to talk. The words, rusty and painful, started to flow. He spoke of the cold, of the fear of Tommy from Liverpool. He didn't speak as a hero, but as a young man who had led other young men into a nightmare and had carried the weight of it every day since. He spoke of the silence he had kept, the belief that to speak of it was to dishonor the memory by sharing the burden. Captain Jameson listened, not as an inquisitor, but as a fellow soldier. The human story was bridging the gap that protocol had created. Outside the office, Tomo stood against a wall, his mind a storm. He felt the cold weight of potential disgrace. Yet, he couldn't bring himself to regret it. The image of the old man's face, crumbling under the weight of a memory so potent it could physically buckle him, was seared into his mind. He thought of his own grandfather, who had passed away the previous year, a man of few words who had served in a different time. He wondered what silent battles he had fought. When the door opened and Mac emerged, followed by Captain Jameson, Tomo snapped back to attention. But the captain's demeanor had changed. "Private Evans," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. "You will resume your duties. You will face no formal disciplinary action." He paused, choosing his words with care. "What you did was, technically, a failure of your post. But it was not a failure of your character. There will be a discussion later about finding the line between compassion and duty. For now, consider this a lesson in the weight of history that walks past our sentry boxes every day." Dismissed. The relief was so profound it made Tomo lightheaded. He managed a "thank you, sir," before turning to Mac. The old veteran extended his hand. Tomo took it, feeling the strength still in the gnarled fingers. "Thank you, son," Mac said, his voice thick. "You have no idea." "I think I'm starting to, sir," Tomo replied quietly. This could have been the end, a poignant moment, a crisis averted. But life and healing are rarely so neat. Captain Jameson, moved by the encounter and recognizing a deeper need, made an unusual suggestion. "Mr. McAllister," he said, "we have a system, a tradition within the tradition. The soldiers who stand guard, they carry more than just rifles. They carry the stories of this place, and sometimes they need to unburden their own. We have a chaplain, an old guardsman himself. He's someone who understands a silence man like you, and men like Evans here often keep. Would you speak with him? Not as an order, but as an offer from one soldier to another." Mac was wary. A lifetime of self-reliance had built high walls. But the dam had already cracked. He had spoken of Tommy to the captain. The young guardsman before him had seen his deepest shame and responded not with pity, but with a shared tear. His isolation, his fortress of silence, had been breached by an act of incredible humanity. He was tired, so terribly tired of carrying it all alone. He nodded. "All right," he said, a simple word that felt like the lifting of a mountain. Days later, Mac returned to the palace grounds, not as a spectator, but as a guest. He met with the chaplain, a man in his 60s with calm eyes and a gentle manner that held a core of steel. They talked in a quiet garden, away from the pomp and the tourists. Mac talked more. He talked about coming home to a country that didn't understand his war, about the struggle to build a life on a foundation of frozen memories, about the love of his late wife who had accepted his nightmares without ever truly knowing their source. It was the beginning of a long-delayed unburdening. Meanwhile, Tomo returned to his post. But he was changed. He now saw the crowd differently. He saw the old men with their medals pinned to blazers, the middle-aged women with sad, distant eyes, the young veterans with prosthetic limbs. He saw the potential for hidden battles behind every face. His discipline became not a wall, but a filter. He learned to project that same unwavering strength, but now with an internal awareness, a silent sentinel not just for the crown, but for the quiet suffering that passed before him. He and Mac began to meet occasionally by prearrangement in a cafe near the barracks. They spoke little of their respective wars in detail, but a great deal about their aftermath, the struggle for normalcy, the importance of routine, the unspoken language of those who have served. A surrogate grandfather-grandson relationship bloomed, built on a foundation of mutual respect and a shared understanding of a world civilians could never fully enter. The story of the weeping guardsman and the veteran did not remain a secret. In the age of smartphones, it was inevitable. A blurred, shaky video surfaced online. It was short, grainy, but unmistakable. The rigid guardsman, the single tear the old veteran's anguished face. It went viral, not with mocking commentary, but with a wave of profound empathy. Headlines read, "The human behind the bearskin," and "When duty and compassion collide." The Ministry of Defense was initially flustered, but the public reaction was overwhelmingly positive. It humanized an institution often seen as remote and rigid. Quietly, internally, the incident prompted a review. While the absolute discipline of the Guard remained sacrosanct, a new, subtle layer of training was discussed, a heightened emphasis on situational awareness that extended to the well-being of the public, recognizing that the greatest strength can sometimes lie in knowing when a strictly human response is the most dignified one of all. For Mac, the journey continued. With the chaplain's guidance and his unexpected friendship with Tomo, he began to truly process his grief and guilt. He visited the Korean War Memorial in London, something he had avoided for decades. He placed a poppy there, not just for Tommy, but for the young man he himself had been. He began to write down his memories, not as a chronicle of horror, but as letters to his own grandchildren, who now asked questions about the medals in his drawer. He was no longer just a keeper of ghosts. He was becoming a storyteller, passing on history so it wouldn't be forgotten. Months later, on a bright spring morning, Max stood again by the Victoria Memorial. Tomo was on duty. Their eyes met, as they often did now, a brief, acknowledging flicker that held a universe of shared understanding. A new set of tourists chattered and pointed. A child cried, and Mac felt the familiar cold clutch in his stomach, but this time it did not overwhelm him. He acknowledged it, breathed through it, and remained standing firm. He watched Tomo, the perfect soldier, and saw not an impenetrable statue, but a young man of profound strength and compassion. He saw the living link between the forgotten war of his youth and the serving soldiers of today. The ceremony ended. The new guard was posted. As Tomo marched off with his detail, he allowed himself one last, slight deviation. As he passed Mac's position, his marching arm swung with precision, but his head turned just for a fraction of a second, and he gave the old veteran a small, warm, genuine smile. A smile that held no grief, only respect and connection. It was a smile between soldiers, between friends, between generations bound by a common, unspoken language of service and sacrifice. Mac returned the smile, a real one that reached his eyes. He turned and walked away from the palace, not with the heavy tread of a man carrying a burden alone, but with the lighter step of a man who had finally shared it. The guards remained, stoic and timeless, but Mac now knew a beautiful secret. Within that immovable facade beat a human heart, ever vigilant, capable of acknowledging the deepest wounds with nothing more than a shared silence and a single compassionate tear. The forgotten soldier had been remembered, and in that remembrance, he found a peace that had eluded him for a lifetime.